August 15th, 2012. Inside Belcourt Castle, a 60-room mansion on the edge of Newport's historic district, an elderly woman named Harley Tinney stood in what used to be the ballroom and faced an impossible decision. She was 89 years old. Her family had owned this castle for 58 years, pouring millions into restoring it, fighting to preserve it, opening it to tourists to keep the lights on. Now the state of Rhode Island was threatening to seize it. Code violations, structural issues, unpaid bills. The castle that had survived 120 years of scandals, bankruptcies, and abandonment was about to be condemned by bureaucrats with clipboards. This wasn't supposed to happen. Belcourt was meant to be different from the other Newport mansions. It was never designed as a summer cottage for idle aristocrats. It was built as a bachelor's stable, a palace for horses where the animals lived better than most Americans. The first floor was entirely devoted to stalls and carriages. The owners lived upstairs, above the smell of hay and manure. Oliver Perry Belmont had commissioned it in 1894, spending $3 million to prove that he loved horses more than human company. The mansion was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who created the breakers for the Vanderbilts. Hunt was at the peak of his powers, creating Newport palaces that would define American architecture for generations. But Belcourt was different. Hunt had built pleasure palaces before, but never one where the ground floor was a stable, where Gothic revival architecture housed thoroughbreds, where the scent of horses permeated everything. Harl Tinney had given her entire adult life to this building. She and her husband Donald had purchased it in 1954 for $24,500, a fraction of what it cost to build. The castle was in ruins then, abandoned for over a decade. Windows broken, roof leaking, interior stripped of anything valuable. The Tinneys saw potential. They saw history worth saving. They spent 58 years and millions of dollars restoring every room, hunting down original furnishings, opening the castle to tourists to generate income. Now in 2012, the state was telling her it was all for nothing. The violations were too extensive. The building was unsafe. She had 60 days to fix problems that would cost millions to address, or Belcourt would be shut down permanently. Harl had no money left. Every dollar had gone into the castle. She had already mortgaged everything she owned. Banks wouldn't lend against the property the state was threatening to condemn. She couldn't sell it. Who would buy a castle facing closure? She couldn't afford to keep it. The maintenance alone consumed every penny the tourist admission generated. This was a building that required constant infusions of money just to survive, and the money had run out decades ago. Outside, Newport's other mansions operated smoothly as museum properties managed by the Preservation Society. The breakers attracted 300,000 visitors annually. Marble House gleamed with fresh restoration. Rosecliff hosted weddings and movie shoots. Those mansions had surrendered private ownership, becoming public trusts with professional management and substantial endowments. Belcourt had remained private. The Tinney family had refused to give it up, believing they could preserve it better than any organization. That decision had seemed noble in 1954. By 2012, it looked like fatal pride. The castle that was built to house the finest horses in America, that had hosted some of the most scandalous society events of the Gilded Age, that had survived over a century of chaos and neglect, was about to die because one family couldn't let go. This is the story of how Oliver Belmont built a palace for horses that shocked Newport society. How his scandalous remarriage to Alva Vanderbilt turned Belcourt into the center of suffragette politics. How the mansion was abandoned, rediscovered, obsessively restored by one family for 6 decades, and ultimately lost when that restoration became an impossible burden. And how the most controversial mansion in Newport finally found stability by being taken from the people who loved it most. If you enjoy exploring the complicated reality of historic preservation and the thin line between passion and obsession, hit that like button and subscribe. Let's begin with the horses. December 1891. Oliver Hazard. Harry Belmont stood on an empty lot on Bellevue Avenue and described his vision to Richard Morris Hunt. He wanted a stable, not a barn behind a mansion, not a carriage house tucked discreetly away, a palace where horses lived on the ground floor and humans lived above them. The whole first floor would be devoted to stalls, tack rooms, carriage storage. The family quarters would occupy the second and third floors, accessible by a grand staircase that rose from the stable area. The smell of horses would permeate everything. That was the point. Hunt was 64 years old, the most celebrated architect in America, designer of the Breakers, Marble House, Biltmore Estate. He had created palaces for Vanderbilts and Astors, translated European grandeur into American monuments. Now Oliver Belmont wanted him to design a house for horses. Hunt could have refused. The commission was bizarre, even by Gilded Age standards. But Oliver Belmont had money, and Hunt had a professional obligation to realize his client's visions, no matter how eccentric. Oliver was 38 years old, recently divorced, heir to a banking fortune. His father, August Belmont, had been one of the most powerful financiers in America, representative of the Rothschild family's interests, chairman of the Democratic National Committee, owner of the most successful racing stable in the country. Oliver had inherited his father's love of horses and his fortune, but not his diplomatic personality. Oliver was known as difficult, eccentric, obsessed with his animals to the exclusion of human relationships. His first marriage to Sarah Swan had ended in divorce after just a few years. Society whispered that he cared more about his horses than his wife. The whispers were probably accurate. Oliver wanted a bachelor residence that would accommodate his two greatest passions, horses and medieval history. He had traveled extensively in Europe, studied Gothic architecture, collected armor and tapestries, and carved furniture from French chateaux. He wanted a Newport mansion that felt like a Loire Valley castle, built of stone and slate, with turrets and Gothic details. And he wanted his horses to live in it with him. Hunt produced designs in early 1892. The structure would occupy a lot Oliver had purchased on Bellevue Avenue, just down the street from where his former father-in-law's mansion stood and not far from Marble House, which was still under construction for the Vanderbilt family. The design was French Gothic revival, inspired by castles Oliver had visited in the Loire Valley. The exterior would be red brick with limestone trim, steep slate roofs, elaborate chimneys, Gothic windows with stone tracery. The ground floor was entirely devoted to stables. 60 feet of the main facade opened into a vaulted carriage hall that could accommodate multiple coaches. Beyond that lay stalls for 30 horses, each stall lined with Italian tile, each fitted with mahogany partitions and brass fixtures. The horses would live in conditions that exceeded what most Newport servants experienced. The tack room was designed like a gentleman's library, paneled in carved wood, fitted with glass cases to display saddles and bridles like works of art. The harness room featured stained glass windows depicting horses, as if this were a chapel devoted to equine worship. Hunt had created ecclesiastical spaces before, but never for animals. A massive staircase rose from the stable area to the family quarters on the second floor. This was the main entrance to the house. Visitors would walk through the stable, past the horses, up the stairs smelling of hay and leather, then emerge into Gothic revival reception rooms filled with medieval armor and carved furniture. The contrast was intentional. Oliver wanted his horses to be the first thing guests encountered, establishing his priorities immediately. The second floor contained the Great Hall, a Gothic revival room 50 feet long with a vaulted ceiling, stained glass windows, and walls covered in carved wood panels imported from French chateaux. The hall was designed to display Oliver's collection of medieval armor. Suits of armor stood along the walls like guards. Tapestries hung from the ceiling. The furniture was massive, carved, uncomfortable, authentically medieval. This wasn't a room for relaxing. It was a room for impressing visitors with the owner's wealth and eccentricity. The ballroom occupied the opposite end of the second floor. It was designed for entertaining, with space for orchestra and dancers, but even here the Gothic influence dominated. The ceiling was coffered and painted with medieval designs. The walls featured more carved panels. The windows were leaded glass in Gothic patterns. The dining room could seat 40 guests at a massive table surrounded by carved chairs that looked like thrones. The kitchen and service areas were tucked into the basement and service wings, connected to the dining room by dumbwaiters and service stairs. The third floor housed the private bedrooms, each decorated in period styles, though Oliver's own bedroom was relatively modest. He didn't care about personal comfort. The rooms that mattered to him were the stable and the Great Hall, where his two obsessions could be properly displayed. Construction began in 1892 and proceeded rapidly. The structure was completed by 1894, ready for Oliver to occupy. The final cost was approximately $3 million, equivalent to over $100 million today. It was expensive but not outrageous by Newport standards. The breakers cost more than twice that amount. Marble House reportedly cost $11 million. But Belcourt was different from those palaces. The breakers and Marble House were designed to impress human guests, to host elaborate parties, to establish social dominance. Belcourt was designed primarily for horses. The human spaces were secondary, almost an afterthought. Oliver moved in during the summer of 1894 with his horses, his armor collection, and no wife. He was living exactly as he wanted, in a castle that reflected his priorities perfectly. Society found it bizarre. A bachelor living above his horses in a Gothic castle filled with medieval armor. But Newport society was accustomed to eccentric millionaires. If Oliver Belmont wanted to live in a stable, that was his choice. What society didn't know in 1894 was that Oliver's bachelor status wouldn't last long. Within 2 years, he would remarry in one of the most scandalous weddings Newport had ever seen. His new wife would transform Belcourt from a peculiar bachelor pad into the center of suffragette politics. And their marriage would prove that sometimes the most controversial relationship produces the most interesting history. January 11th, 1896. Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont married Alva Vanderbilt in a private ceremony that shocked Newport society. The scandal wasn't the marriage itself. It was who Alva had been married to before. Until 7 months earlier, Alva had been Mrs. William Kissam Vanderbilt, one of the most powerful society women in America. She had built Marble House, just down Bellevue Avenue from Belcourt. She had forced her daughter Consuelo into marriage with the Duke of Marlborough, creating an Anglo-American alliance that made headlines worldwide. She had conquered New York society through force of will and Vanderbilt money. Then she divorced William Vanderbilt in 1895, citing adultery. Divorce was scandalous enough among the Newport elite, but Alva made it worse by remarrying within months. And she didn't marry some European nobleman or distant millionaire. She married Oliver Belmont, whose mansion was visible from her own, whose father had been socially inferior to the Vanderbilts, who lived above his horses in a Gothic castle. Society was appalled. Alva didn't care. She had spent her entire life fighting for social position, first as the ambitious daughter of a ruined Southern family, then as William Vanderbilt's wife, forcing her way into Mrs. Astor's inner circle. She had built Marble House to establish dominance, spending $11 million to create a palace that would eclipse all others. But Marble House had never felt like home. It was a monument to ambition, a showplace designed by Richard Morris Hunt to overwhelm visitors. The rooms were cold and formal, filled with marble and gold, beautiful and oppressive. Alva had achieved everything she wanted there and found it empty. Oliver Belmont offered something different. He didn't care about social position. He was already wealthy, already established, completely indifferent to what society thought of him. He lived in a castle above his horses, collected medieval armor, ignored convention entirely. Alva found this refreshing. After decades of fighting for acceptance, she discovered she was tired of fighting. Oliver didn't require her to prove anything. He just wanted her to live in his peculiar castle and be herself. The marriage transformed Belcourt. Alva brought her furniture, her art collection, her energy. She redecorated rooms, modernized systems, made the castle more livable. But she didn't change the fundamental character of the place. The horses still lived on the first floor. The great hall still displayed Oliver's armor. The Gothic atmosphere remained. Alva adapted to Belcourt rather than forcing it to adapt to her. This was new for her. At Marble House, everything had reflected her vision, her taste, her determination to impress. At Belcourt, she was secondary to the horses and the armor. Surprisingly, she didn't mind. The couple settled into a comfortable routine. Summers in Newport at Belcourt, winters in New York, occasional trips to Europe to acquire more medieval artifacts for Oliver's collection. They entertained, but not with the aggressive social climbing that had characterized Alva's first marriage. The parties at Belcourt were smaller, more eccentric, attended by people who appreciated Oliver's unusual interests. Then, in 1908, Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont died suddenly. He was only 50 years old. The cause was appendicitis, a condition that could kill quickly in the era before reliable antibiotics. Alva was devastated. She had been married to Oliver for just 12 years, but they had been the happiest years of her life. He had given her something William Vanderbilt never had: permission to be herself without constantly proving her worth. Oliver left Belcourt to Alva in his will. She inherited the castle, the horses, the armor collection, everything. At 55 years old, Alva Belmont became the widow of an eccentric millionaire, living in a Gothic castle that smelled of horses. She could have sold it, moved back to Marble House or to one of her other properties. Instead, she stayed at Belcourt and transformed it again, this time into headquarters for her newest obsession: women's suffrage. Alva had become radicalized. She had spent her first marriage fighting for social acceptance within a system that gave women no real power. She had divorced William Vanderbilt when she finally understood that social success meant nothing if women couldn't vote, couldn't own property independently, couldn't control their own lives. Now, as a wealthy widow with resources and time, she threw herself into the suffragette movement. Belcourt became a gathering place for suffragettes, a safe space where women could meet, plan, organize. Alva funded suffragette publications, paid for protests, used her society connections to promote the cause. The castle that had been built as a bachelor's stable, that had housed Oliver's horses and medieval armor, became the center of radical politics. The irony was perfect. The most conservative neighborhood in America, where old money summered and social hierarchy was rigid, now hosted suffragette meetings in a castle that still smelled faintly of horses. Alva held rallies on the lawn at Belcourt. She invited suffragette leaders to stay in the guest rooms. She converted the Great Hall, with its armor and Gothic atmosphere, into a meeting space for planning protests and political action. Society was scandalized again. But Alva had moved beyond caring about Newport society's approval. She had everything she needed: money, a castle, a cause worth fighting for. The horses were mostly gone by then. Oliver's stable had been reduced after his death. The stalls on the first floor were converted to storage and additional reception rooms. But the essential character remained. Belcourt was still the most unusual mansion in Newport, still the place where convention went to die. Alva lived at Belcourt until 1932, when she was 79 years old. By then, she had seen women gain the right to vote, had outlived both her husbands, had transformed from a social climber into a political radical. She had owned Belcourt for 24 years, longer than Oliver had lived there. The castle was as much hers as his. When she died in January 1933, her estate was valued at approximately $4 million, a comfortable fortune but nothing compared to the Vanderbilt wealth she had once accessed. The Depression had reduced everyone's fortunes. What had seemed like permanent wealth in the 1890s had proven temporary. Belcourt passed to her heirs, who didn't want it. The castle was expensive to maintain, old-fashioned, tainted by its association with radical politics. The horses were gone. The suffragette meetings were over. What remained was a Gothic revival mansion that didn't fit the modern world. Within 2 years, Belcourt was sold, then sold again. It changed hands repeatedly through the 1930s and 1940s, each owner discovering the same problem. The castle was magnificent but useless. Too expensive to maintain as a private residence. Too eccentric to convert into something else. Too significant to demolish. By 1950, Belcourt stood empty, windows broken, roof leaking, interior stripped of anything valuable by vandals and desperate owners selling off assets. The palace that had shocked Newport society, that had housed the finest horses in America, that had been the center of suffragette politics, was dying of abandonment. The question wasn't whether someone would save it. The question was why anyone would try. July 1954. Donald Tinney and his wife Harl stood in the ruins of Belcourt Castle and saw potential. They were looking at broken windows, water-damaged ceilings, walls stripped of their carved panels, floors covered in debris. The castle had been empty for years, vandalized and neglected. The asking price was $24,500, a fraction of the $3 million it had cost to build 60 years earlier. Most people would have seen a money pit, an impossible restoration project, a castle too far gone to save. The Tinneys saw their life's work. Donald Tinney was 41 years old, a successful design consultant, an antiques dealer with an eye for quality and a passion for historic preservation. Harl was 31, equally committed to preserving the past. They had been looking for a property in Newport, something they could restore and open to the public. Belcourt was available, and despite its condition, the bones were good. The structure was sound. The Gothic revival architecture was intact. The grand staircase still rose from the former stable area. The great hall still had its vaulted ceiling. Everything that mattered was still there, just damaged and stripped bare. They purchased Belcourt in 1954 and began what would become a 58-year obsession. The restoration started immediately. The Tinneys moved into the upper floors while work progressed below. They lived surrounded by construction, sleeping in rooms that leaked when it rained, cooking in a kitchen that barely functioned, ignoring the discomfort because they were saving something important. The first priority was making the structure weathertight. The roof needed extensive repair. Windows had to be replaced. The exterior masonry required repointing. These weren't glamorous projects, but they were essential. Without a sound envelope, the interior would continue deteriorating no matter how much money was spent on decoration. Donald and Harl spent their own money on the initial work, then opened Belcourt to tourists in 1956 to generate income. They charged admission, gave tours, told the story of Oliver Belmont and his horses, of Alva and her suffragettes, of the castle's long decline and ongoing restoration. Visitors were fascinated. The other Newport mansions were pristine museum properties managed by the Preservation Society. Belcourt was a work in progress, a restoration happening in real time, a castle still rough around the edges. Some people found this authentic, others found it disappointing. They wanted the polished perfection of the breakers, not a castle where the owners were still hanging drywall. The Tinneys didn't care about those complaints. They were building something different, a living restoration rather than a static museum. They would fix one room, open it to tours, use that income to fix the next room. It was slow, exhausting, never-ending work. Every dollar earned went back into the building. The Tinneys lived modestly, drove old cars, wore unfashionable clothes, sacrificed everything to the castle. Donald had a particular vision for how Belcourt should be furnished. He didn't want to recreate exactly how Oliver and Alva had decorated it. Many of the original furnishings were long gone, sold off by previous owners. Instead, Donald collected period-appropriate pieces from European estates and American auctions. He hunted for medieval and Renaissance furniture, for carved wood panels from French chateaux, for stained glass windows from demolished churches. He filled Belcourt with objects that would have fit Oliver's Gothic vision, creating a castle that felt authentically medieval, even if the specific pieces weren't original to the house. Some purists objected to this approach. Historic preservation professionals argued that the Tinneys should either restore Belcourt to a specific documented period or clearly label everything as reproduction. Instead, Donald was creating an idealized version of how the castle might have looked, mixing original architectural elements with collected furnishings that matched the Gothic atmosphere. The Tinneys believed this approach was more honest than trying to fake a perfect restoration with reproductions. They were showing what a wealthy collector in the Gilded Age would have assembled, using real antiques to create an authentic feel, even if the exact provenance didn't match. The Great Hall became Donald's masterpiece. He filled it with armor and weapons, some from Oliver's original collection that he tracked down at auction, others that he acquired to replace pieces that were lost. He hung tapestries from the ceiling, placed carved furniture around the perimeter, created a space that looked like a medieval castle hall transplanted to Newport. Visitors entered through what had been the stable area, just as they had in Oliver's time, though the stalls were now converted to reception rooms and gift shop space. The grand staircase led up to the second floor, and suddenly you were in the Middle Ages, surrounded by armor and Gothic woodwork and stained glass windows. It was theatrical, overwhelming, completely different from any other Newport mansion. By the 1970s, Belcourt was attracting steady tourist traffic. Not the massive crowds that the Preservation Society properties drew, but enough to keep the restoration funded. The Tinneys reinvested every penny. They repaired the ballroom ceiling, restored the dining room, fixed the service stairs, upgraded the electrical system, addressed decades of deferred maintenance. The work never stopped. A building that size always needs something. The slate roof required constant attention. The masonry needed periodic repointing. The mechanical systems wore out and needed replacement. And as the Tinneys aged, the physical demands became harder. Donald was doing much of the work himself in the early years, but by the 1980s, he was in his 60s, unable to climb ladders and haul materials like he once did. They hired contractors for major projects, but contractors were expensive, and the tourist income barely covered costs. The Tinneys began mortgaging the property to fund restoration work. They took out loans against Belcourt's value, confident that the increased tourist revenue would cover the payments. But tourist revenue didn't increase fast enough. The other Newport mansions were marketing aggressively, offering combination tickets, attracting tour buses. Belcourt remained independent, quirky, less accessible. It developed a reputation as the castle you visited if you had extra time after seeing the major properties. Donald Tinney died in 1989 at age 76. He had spent 35 years restoring Belcourt, living in it, opening it to the public, sacrificing his health and wealth to preserve something he believed was important. Harl was 66 years old when she became a widow, left alone in a castle that still needed millions of dollars of work. She could have sold it then. The Preservation Society would have considered purchasing Belcourt to add to their collection of house museums. Other organizations expressed interest, but Harl refused every offer. Donald had given his life to this restoration. She would finish what he started. For the next 23 years, Harl Tinney lived alone in Belcourt, continuing the restoration, giving tours, managing the property with a tiny staff and dwindling resources. She was in her 70s, then her 80s, still climbing stairs, still overseeing repairs, still fighting to keep the castle open. The building was her entire life. She had no children. Her friends had drifted away over the decades, exhausted by her single-minded obsession with Belcourt. The castle was her family, her purpose, her prison, and it was slowly killing her financially. By 2010, Harl Tinney was 87 years old and drowning in debt. The mortgages on Belcourt had ballooned over the years. She had borrowed against the property repeatedly to fund restoration work, always believing that the next project would increase tourism enough to cover the loans. It never did. The castle required too much maintenance. Every dollar earned went immediately back into repairs. There was never enough left over to pay down the principal on the loans. The interest compounded. The banks threatened foreclosure. Harl was trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape. Then the state inspectors arrived. Rhode Island's Historical Preservation Office and Building Code Enforcement had received complaints about Belcourt. Visitors reported safety concerns, cracked ceilings, unstable stairs, electrical issues. The state sent inspectors in 2011 to assess the property. What they found was alarming. Decades of deferred maintenance had created genuine safety hazards. The roof was failing in multiple locations. Water damage had compromised some structural elements. The electrical system was outdated and potentially dangerous. The heating system was a fire hazard. The list of code violations ran to multiple pages. Harl was given a deadline: fix the violations or the castle would be condemned and closed to the public. The repairs would cost at least $2 million, possibly more. Harl didn't have $2 million. She didn't have $200,000. Every asset she owned was already mortgaged. The banks wouldn't lend her more money against a property the state was threatening to condemn. She tried to fundraise, reaching out to preservation organizations, historical societies, wealthy Newport residents. The response was underwhelming. Many people felt the Tinneys had created their own problems by refusing to work with established preservation organizations. If they had donated Belcourt to the Preservation Society decades earlier, it would be properly maintained now. Instead, they had held on for 58 years out of pride and stubbornness, and now they wanted other people to bail them out. The criticism was harsh, but not entirely unfair. The Tinneys had been offered help repeatedly over the years. They had always refused, insisting they could manage the restoration themselves. Now the consequences of that independence were coming due. August 2012. Harl Tinney stood in the ballroom of Belcourt Castle, surrounded by the furniture and artifacts she and Donald had spent a lifetime collecting, and accepted that she had lost. The state deadline was approaching. She had no way to fund the required repairs. The bank was moving toward foreclosure on the mortgages. The castle that had survived 118 years, that had housed horses and suffragettes and radical politics, that had been abandoned and rediscovered and obsessively restored, was about to be taken from her. On September 17, 2012, a judge ordered Belcourt Castle closed to the public due to safety violations. The tourists stopped coming. The admission revenue stopped flowing. Harl remained in the castle, living in her private apartment on the upper floor, but she couldn't open the building for tours. The very thing that had funded the restoration for 58 years was now prohibited. In 2013, the bank foreclosed on the property. Harl Tinney lost Belcourt after owning it for 59 years. She and Donald had purchased it for $24,500 in 1954. They had poured millions into restoration. They had given their entire adult lives to preserving it. Now it was taken from them, sold at auction to satisfy the debts they had accumulated trying to save it. Harl died in 2014 at age 89, just 2 years after losing Belcourt. Friends said she never recovered from the loss. The castle had been her life's work, her purpose, her identity. Without it, she simply faded away. The obsession that had sustained her for 6 decades became the thing that destroyed her. She had refused to let go when she should have, refused help when it was offered, held on until the burden crushed her. The love that drove her to preserve Belcourt became the pride that prevented her from saving it. After the foreclosure, Belcourt was purchased by Alex and Annie founder Carolyn Raphaelian for $3.6 million in 2013. Raphaelian was a Rhode Island jewelry designer who had built a successful business and wanted to preserve an important piece of Newport history. She had the resources the Tinneys lacked: substantial capital, business experience, understanding of how to monetize a historic property. She immediately invested millions in addressing the code violations and structural issues. The roof was repaired, the electrical system was upgraded, the mechanical systems were modernized. The work the Tinneys couldn't afford was completed in less than 2 years. Raphaelian reopened Belcourt to tourists in 2015, but with a different model than the Tinneys had used. Instead of relying primarily on admission fees, she marketed the castle for private events: weddings, corporate functions, film shoots. The Gothic atmosphere that made Belcourt too eccentric for some tourists made it perfect for special events. People wanted to get married in a castle that felt authentically medieval, wanted to host parties surrounded by armor and stained glass. The event revenue exceeded what the Tinneys had ever generated from tourist admissions. Suddenly, Belcourt was profitable, not just breaking even, actually making money. The building that had bankrupted the Tinneys was thriving under different management. The difference wasn't the building, it was the approach. The Tinneys had treated Belcourt as a personal restoration project that happened to generate some tourist income. Raphaelian treated it as a business asset that happened to be historically significant. Both approaches came from love of the property, but only one was financially sustainable. In 2020, Raphaelian sold Belcourt to singer Carolyn Raphaelian for $3.6 million. Actually, let me correct this. In 2020, Carolyn Raphaelian sold Belcourt to a New York-based developer for an undisclosed price. The property continues to operate as a venue for events and limited tours. Today, Belcourt Castle remains privately owned and operated. It's not part of the Preservation Society's collection of house museums. It's not open for daily tours like the Breakers or Marble House. Instead, it operates primarily as an event venue, hosting weddings and private functions, with occasional public tours offered on a limited basis. The restoration work that Donald and Harley Tinney began in 1954 has been completed by subsequent owners with deeper pockets. The castle looks better now than it has in decades, perhaps better than it looked in Oliver Belmont's time. The Great Hall still displays medieval armor, though much of it was sold off during the financial troubles and has been replaced with other period pieces. The Gothic atmosphere remains. You can still see the grand staircase rising from what used to be the stable area. You can still feel the presence of horses in the architecture, even though the stalls are long gone. Belcourt survived, but not the way the Tinneys hoped. They wanted to preserve it as a public museum, accessible to anyone interested in history. Instead, it became a luxury event venue, accessible primarily to people who can afford to rent a castle for their wedding. The irony is sharp. The Tinneys sacrificed everything to keep Belcourt public and lost it. The current owners keep it mostly private and profit from it. There's a lesson in that contrast, though it's not a simple one. Historic preservation requires enormous resources. Buildings like Belcourt need millions of dollars in maintenance over decades. That money has to come from somewhere. The Tinneys tried to generate it through admission fees and personal sacrifice. It wasn't enough. Current owners generate it through event rentals and private functions. That works financially, but it means fewer people experience the building. The Preservation Society model, used at the Breakers and other Newport mansions, generates revenue through high-volume tourism. That works too, but it requires surrendering private ownership and accepting organizational management. Each approach has trade-offs. The Tinneys chose independence and paid with their life savings and ultimately the property itself. The Preservation Society mansions chose institutional management and gained stability, but lost individual character. Belcourt's current owners chose the event venue model and gained profitability, but reduced public access. None of these choices is obviously superior. They're just different ways of solving the same problem. How do you preserve a Gilded Age palace in a world that no longer produces the fortunes required to maintain them? Oliver Belmont spent $3 million building a palace for his horses. He enjoyed it for 14 years before dying at 50. Alva Belmont transformed it into suffragette headquarters and lived there 24 years. Then it sat empty for years until Donald and Harl Tinney sacrificed their lives trying to restore it. Now it hosts weddings for people who want Gothic atmosphere for their Instagram photos. Each era reimagines Belcourt according to contemporary needs. The building adapts or dies. That's the real lesson of Belcourt Castle. Historic preservation isn't about freezing a building in time. It's about finding new purposes for old structures, new ways to make them relevant to people who don't share the values of the original owners. Oliver Belmont built Belcourt because he loved horses more than people. That purpose died with him. Alva transformed it for suffragette politics. That purpose died when women got the vote. The Tinneys restored it as a museum to Gilded Age excess. That purpose died when they ran out of money. Now it's an event venue, and that purpose works because people value experiences more than history. They don't come to Belcourt to learn about Oliver Belmont's horses or Alva's suffragettes. They come to get married in a castle, to host a party surrounded by armor, to create memories in a space that feels removed from ordinary life. Is that better or worse than the Tinneys' vision of public education through museum tours? It's different. It keeps the building maintained and generating revenue. It preserves the architecture and atmosphere. It just serves a different audience for a different purpose. The building doesn't care. Belcourt has survived 130 years by adapting to whoever owned it. It was a stable that shocked society. It was a suffragette headquarters. It was a restoration project that bankrupted its owners. Now it's a wedding venue. In another 30 years, it might be something else entirely. As long as someone finds a use for it, as long as someone generates enough revenue to maintain it, Belcourt will survive. That's a more pragmatic view of preservation than the romantic vision Donald and Harl Tinney held. They believed buildings should be saved for their historic importance, that the public had a right to experience them, that education and access were the highest purposes of preservation. Those are beautiful ideals. They're also expensive ideals that require either institutional support or personal wealth far beyond what the Tinneys possessed. The Tinneys tried to preserve Belcourt through love and determination alone. It wasn't enough. Love doesn't pay the property taxes. Determination doesn't fix a failing roof. Historic buildings need money, constant and substantial amounts of money, and love is not a monetizable asset. The people who save historic buildings are the people who figure out how to monetize them. The Preservation Society monetizes through high-volume tourism. Current Belcourt owners monetize through event rentals. Both approaches work because they generate more revenue than expenses. The Tinneys never achieved that balance. They spent more than they earned for 58 years, making up the difference through personal savings and borrowed money until both ran out. Their failure wasn't a failure of love or commitment. It was a failure of business model. They needed Belcourt to generate $200,000 per year to cover expenses and debt service. They generated perhaps $100,000 in good years. That gap compounded for decades until it destroyed them. Could they have succeeded with a different approach? Possibly. If they had partnered with the Preservation Society in the 1960s or 70s, donated the property in exchange for lifetime residence and input on restoration decisions, Belcourt might be a thriving museum today. If they had embraced the event venue model earlier, they might have generated enough revenue to stay solvent. If they had been willing to compromise their vision, they might have kept their castle. But they weren't willing to compromise. Donald and Harl Tinney believed they were the right people to restore Belcourt, that their vision was the correct one, that independence was worth the cost. They held that belief until it destroyed them. That stubbornness was simultaneously their greatest strength and fatal flaw. Newport is full of preserved mansions, but most of them survived by surrendering to institutional management. The Breakers, Marble House, Rosecliff, all survived because families gave them up. They recognized that private ownership was no longer sustainable and found organizations capable of maintaining them permanently. Those mansions are pristine today, professionally managed, accessible to hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. Belcourt survived by changing hands repeatedly, each owner discovering it was too expensive to keep, each eventually selling to someone with fresher capital and renewed optimism. The castle that was built for horses became a cautionary tale about the cost of holding on too tightly. Harl Tinney died having lost everything she spent a lifetime building. The restoration she and Donald created was dismantled and redone by people with more money. Their vision for Belcourt as a public museum was replaced by a private event venue model. The building survived, but their dream didn't. That's the tragedy and perhaps the inevitability of private historic preservation. Buildings outlast their owners' visions. Purposes change. What seems essential to one generation becomes irrelevant to the next. Oliver Belmont thought living above his horses was the height of sophisticated eccentricity. Subsequent generations found it bizarre and converted the stables to other uses. Alva thought suffragette meetings in a Gothic castle were revolutionary. History moved on and made that particular revolution unnecessary. The Tinneys thought public museum access was the highest purpose for Belcourt. The market disagreed and rewarded event venue management instead. Belcourt Castle stands today not because anyone successfully preserved Oliver Belmont's original vision, but because each generation found new uses for the space he created. The architecture adapted, the purposes changed, the building survived by being flexible enough to serve whoever owned it, by being valuable enough that someone always wanted it even when the previous owner had been crushed by its cost. That's the real story of Belcourt. Not that it was saved, but that it keeps being saved, over and over, by different people for different reasons. Oliver saved it by building it fireproof with quality materials. Alva saved it by maintaining it during her widowhood. The Tinneys saved it by restoring it from ruins. Raphaelians saved it by addressing code violations. Current owners save it by making it profitable. Each act of salvation was temporary, requiring the next owner to save it again. Historic preservation isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process that never ends, that requires each generation to find reasons and resources to keep caring. The buildings that survive are the ones that remain useful, that adapt to contemporary needs, that generate enough value to justify their maintenance costs. Belcourt survives because it's a spectacular space that people want to experience, whether they come to learn about Oliver Belmont's horses or to get married surrounded by Gothic atmosphere. As long as that desire exists, someone will maintain Belcourt. The specific purpose matters less than the underlying value. The castle that shocked society by putting horses on the first floor now hosts weddings in spaces that once smelled of hay and manure. Oliver Belmont would probably find that appalling, but he would understand that the building survived by adapting, by being more valuable than the cost of maintaining it. And maybe that's enough. Not every building deserves to survive. Most don't. The ones that make it are the ones that keep mattering to whoever owns them, that remain worth the extraordinary cost of preservation. Belcourt has cleared that bar for 130 years through very different purposes, serving very different owners. It will probably clear it for another 130 years, though nobody today can predict what purpose it will serve or who will own it. The castle built for horses has already been a bachelor pad, a suffragette headquarters, a restoration project, and a wedding venue. Whatever comes next will be just as surprising and just as necessary for its continued survival.